I'm going to talk this afternoon about sort of Wesleyan anthropology and the politics of race. And I'm going old school and doing an actual sort of more lecture than PowerPoint presentation. So you'll have to actually pay attention for the next little while in this case. The topic of race continues to be threaded through the fabric of the culture in the United States. It's a topic that presses a lot of buttons for those on all sides of the issue. There are those who do not understand why this continues to be an issue given that slavery has ended. There are those who still agree with Du Bois that the color line is still the predominant issue of the 21st century, and we can find every conceivable position in between. This morning, or this afternoon, I should say, I'm going to wade into this issue from the perspective of Wesleyan anthropology. This is not a normal starting place for a conversation on race, and I admit as an African American, it is problematic in various ways given that Wesley is a European male. Yet I do believe that Wesley does offer some insights into the conversation, particularly as we think about the difference between existing and equality. Existing recognizes that we have to coexist with one another, but the impetus is on one side to accommodate to the other's structures. In many cases, those who expect others to accommodate do not recognize the structure in place. Howard Thurman expresses this ideal in these words: "It is easy to have fellowship on your own terms and to repudiate it if your terms are not acceptable." Equality is we all truly have a say in the structures of our being together. Obviously, these are not technical definitions, but meant to help differentiate what I believe to be one of the challenges we face in race dialogues. For example, this quote from Richard Allen highlights the difference I'm proposing. Allen states, "Reverend Bishop Asbury sent for me to meet him at Henry Gaff's. I did so. He told me he wished me to travel with him. He told me in the slave countries or counties, Carolina and the other places, I must not intermix with the slaves and I would frequently have to sleep in the carriage. And he would allow me my victuals and clothes. I told him I would not travel with him on these conditions. He asked me my reason. I told him if I was taken sick, who was to support me? And that I thought people ought to lay up something while they were able to support themselves in the time of sickness or old age. He said that was as much as he got, his victuals and clothes. I told him he would be taken care of. Let his affliction be as they were, or let him be taken sick where he would be taken care of, but I doubted it would be the case with myself." End of quote. I am arguing that Asbury is working with an understanding of blacks and whites existing together. Asbury does not fully comprehend the ways in which the structures of society benefit him as a white male. I am tickled in a sad way that Asbury asked Allen why he does not agree with wanting to sleep in a carriage and not intermix with his sisters and brothers in bondage. It is a blindness that is so much a part of the structures of society that Asbury accepts it as normative. Allen perceives it as being treated as a second-class citizen. It is the difference between existing and equality. Allen is not interested in simply existing. The politics of race in the United States has promoted existing. Let me highlight three characteristics that undergird this notion of existing. First is the idea of the primacy of whiteness. The idea is that whiteness is ontologically primary over blackness. Jefferson captures this ideal in his notes on the state of Virginia when he says, "Whether the black of the Negro resides in the reticular membranes between the skin and the scarf skin, or in the scarf skin itself, whether it proceeds from the color of the blood, the color of the bile, or from that of some secretion, the difference is fixed in nature, and it is as real as if its seat and cause were better known to us. And is the difference of no importance? Is it not the foundation of a greater and or less share of beauty in the two races?" The difference is fixed in nature. Whiteness should be primary over blackness. This primacy means that while African Americans can coexist in the same culture as whites, African Americans will always be second-class citizens to whites. There is a difference between the two that gets manifest in structural ways. For Jefferson and others, blackness is a different category than whiteness. The structure of society should reflect this difference. Second is social incompatibility. The idea is that at the heart of it, the races are not compatible with one another. There is something fundamentally different between blacks and whites that needs to be recognized. Gilbert Haven, a white abolitionist, put it this way: but equality at the polis is not the only work laid upon the coming government. There must be such a disposition of its patronage, such a steadfast expression of its conviction, such an employment of its influence, as will tend to the abolition of the whole mass of prejudice that still defines the national heart. I am aware that this evil cannot be utterly abolished by any enactments. The leprosy lies deep within. It dwells in our churches, in our souls, in our education, in our society. We sometimes hear the phrase, "I cannot believe this happened in my neighborhood." The implication is we do not have those folk who are not compatible with us in this neighborhood, so it is a shock that such a thing would happen here. If we can erect social barriers between the races, then coexisting is easier because it minimizes the interactions. It means the set ways in which we share space benefit some over others. And the third is paternalism. The idea that we know what is best for you. The idea of paternalism has deep roots going back to the American Society for Colonization for the Free People of Color. The goal was to ship free Africans back to Africa as the best thing for them. This plan was supported by the Methodist Church at the time. This paternalism continues today when someone outside of a community determines what is best for the community without ever talking to those who actually reside in the community. An example is congregations going to so-called urban areas with an agenda they set, but not an agenda set by the residents. Paternalism allows for solutions that make some individuals feel like they have been helpful without actually altering the structures of society. Now, I recognize these are brief descriptions of what it means to exist, but I hope it helps to contextualize the issue. Where I am headed is if we take our Wesleyan theological roots seriously, then John Wesley implies we should be promoting equality. Wesley's anthropology offers a vision for moving from existing to equality. This afternoon, I will make some initial suggestions on why I believe this is the case and what it means for the politics of race in the United States. Just to briefly, Wesley, source-wise, people always talk about the quadrilateral, so I'm not going to take us down that path. He does believe in scripture, reason, and tradition, although he thinks of experience different than the way we use that term today. But more important to me is Wesley's norm, and Wesley's norm was holiness. For Wesley, holiness is the center that he believes holds everything together theologically. It's the telos and a process in which humans are called to be engaged. For Wesley, we are being formed into new beings and ultimately seek to be fully human as Christ was fully human. So for Wesley, holiness links theological concepts like anthropology, grace, soteriology. Holiness is sort of the centerpiece of Wesley's theology. Having laid that out, I want to specifically talk about the Imago Dei, which gets to the heart of Wesley's anthropology. In his sermon in New Birth, Wesley writes this: "And God, the three-one God, said, 'Let us make humans in our own image, after our own likeness.' So God created humans in God's own image. In the image of God created he him. Not barely in his natural image, a picture of his own immortality, a spiritual being endued with understanding, freedom of will, and various affections, nor merely in his political image, the governor of this lower world, having dominion over the fishes of the sea and over all the earth. but chiefly in his moral image, which, according to the apostle, is righteousness and true holiness. In this image of God was humanity made. Wesley clearly lays out his tripartite understanding of humans being created in the image of God. For Wesley, humans fall, obviously, because of sin. And if you read his sermon called The Image of God, he goes into more detail than you would ever want to read on how this takes place, going through Adam and all this other stuff. But just for us, Wesley really sort of follows, in this sense, Augustine and total depravity and sort of Western theological thought. And Wesley believes that because we are fallen, that everyone is touched by sin. No one can escape this possibility. And for Wesley, it creates a loss of holiness in the sense that we are no longer capable of that which God intended for us without God's intervention. And because of this, Wesley talks about this tripartite image in this way. He says the natural image remains, but it becomes distorted. So it's characteristic of what it means to be human, but we no longer are reflecting a natural image in the way that we're supposed to because it's distorted. So our understanding and will are now distorted and not created in the way that God intended. We still have understanding, but it's clouded. And we still have liberty, but our liberty is no longer under God. The only thing that completely keeps us from being completely lost for Wesley is what he calls preventing grace. Oftentimes you'll hear people say prevenient grace, but Wesley never actually used that term. Wesley always used the term preventing, so it would be preventing grace. God prevents us from experiencing the full consequences of being lost, and this is true for everyone. So the natural image is distorted. As a result of the fall, the political image remains, but not to the same degree. So for Wesley, we're no longer stewards that we were intended to be, and this is a relational issue for Wesley. It's how we interact with one another. Let me summarize what Ted Weber says about this particular loss of the political image. He says, the constitution of the political image has been lost, the representational aspect. The political image, the constitutional image of the political image has not been lost. The representational aspect has been lost. So what Weber is saying is the constitutional aspect simply means we are still in the role of stewards, but we no longer are representing God's interest in that role. So our relationships with God and our relationships with each other are then messed up because of the fall that has taken place. Weber's insight is helpful because it helps us to extend the political image to governance. In building the structure of society as we govern, the problem is those structures no longer represent God's interest, but our own self-interest. I'm going to propose that within the context of the United States, a part of that self-interest is promoting structures that maintain a particular power dynamic. A dynamic that pushes us toward racial existence, but not racial equality. And finally, as a result of the fall, the moral image is lost, which is the character of holiness and love. Wesley spends most of his time in his writing on the moral image. And for Wesley, he will often conflate the other images under the moral image and speaks of the moral image sort of as the way that he thinks about the Imago Dei. For Wesley, there's a complete loss of the moral image of God. It's a loss of righteousness. It's a loss of holiness. We're not able to love like God loves. There's no way for us to relate to God without God's intervention because of the loss of the moral image. It is in the recovery of the moral image that Wesley writes that he believes that we have hope as Christians to once again to make right those relationships between God and our fellow neighbors that would help us to move on the right track. So what is necessary for humans is the recovery of this image of God. It is the process of holiness during one's life that takes us on a journey to recover the natural, political, and moral image. And the recovery of the tripart image of God allows us to align ourselves with God to be relational in the right way as God's stewards, to mirror God's justice, mercy, and truth. This restoration of God's image is a soteriological process for Wesley. So then, many of you are familiar then with preventing grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. So for Wesley, it's in working through that process that you recover the sort of imago Dei and you move on to what he would call loving perfection. So the question for me, though, is, are we all human? Are we all human? For most, bless you, this debate is settled today, but unfortunately, it is still an issue. Are we all capable of the journey of holiness towards full humanity? This was also an issue during Wesley's day because of the issue of slavery. And one of Wesley's famous writings is Thoughts Upon Slavery, which is in part a discourse on African humanity. Wesley's account relies heavily on Anthony Benezet, who was a Quaker. By today's standards, we would say Wesley plagiarized. They didn't have quite the same rules back then. So I'm just saying, so if you read Benezet and you read Wesley, it's going to look really similar. What is fascinating here is Wesley doesn't make a biblical argument against slavery for the most part. Wesley seeks to prove that Africans are made in God's image in his argument. When you read it, you can critique Wesley to some extent as coming across as paternalistic. And of course, in Wesley's mind, that's not what he was doing. But from our standards today, looking in hindsight, certainly that could be a fair criticism. But I'm hoping that we can sort of dig underneath that and see what Wesley was trying to do. In the early part of the essay, Wesley sets out to illustrate Africans are as civilized as Europeans. Wesley writes that the fullest are governed by their chief men who rule with much moderation. Few of them will drink anything stronger than water. The government is easy because the people are of quiet and good disposition and so well instructed in what is right that a man who wrongs another is the abomination to all. And what Wesley is trying to do in this part is say that the government is well run and is structured as well as any European government, and that there really is no difference in the way that they have structured their government. What Wesley then goes on to say is the real issue is with those involved in the procuring and removing slaves from their homeland and enslaving them on the plantations are the ones who are not being human. That in fact, if anyone is not capable of this sort of journey towards holiness, it's those individuals who are involved in the trade and not the individuals who are being taken into slavery. So while I'm explaining this from a Christian perspective, one of the challenges for Wesley was he was addressing the question to both Christians and non-Christians. And because of this challenge, this is part of the reason he didn't use strictly a biblical argument. And he tried to convince them really with a natural law argument that equates closely to sort of the natural image of God. We're not going to get too steep in that, but I think it's important to set that context. But the key for me is Wesley is not seeking just to stop slavery, and that is what is critical. He's not just trying to stop slavery, but is arguing Africans are fully human. And this is a radical stance during his day, because there are other individuals who were against slavery, but not many people were actually arguing for the full humanity of Africans. And just a couple of examples. So there were individuals who sought to end slavery but did not buy into the full humanity of Africans. So for example, Richard Allen and others walked out of St. George's Episcopal Church in Philadelphia because they were being treated as second-class people, even though many of those people did not support slavery. So while they didn't support slavery, they also did not support the full humanity of the individuals who were worshiping with them. Also, if you go to someone like George Whitefield, who believed Africans had souls and should be converted to Christianity, but he believed they were predestined to be slaves. So on the one hand, why certainly he believed they should be saved, he believed that their fate would always be that they would be slaves and that they would be nothing else. So you have individuals who are in various spectrums, but in most cases, they were not arguing the same way that Wesley was for the full humanity of Africans. So for Wesley, if we are all human, then no one can be predestined to be a slave. One cannot argue a superiority over another human being. If we all created a natural, political, and moral image of God and seek restoration, then some cannot be elect over others. So it is not the case that some are more or less depraved than others. We are all fallen, and we are all seeking to be restored in Wesley's eyes. So Wesley then lays out in Thoughts Upon Slavery, he writes this: "This is the plain, unaggravated matter of the fact. Such is the manner wherein our African slaves are procured, such a manner wherein removed from their native land, wherein they are treated in our plantations. I would now inquire whether these things can be defended under principles of even heathen honesty, whether they can be reconciled, setting the Bible out of the question, with any degree of either justice or mercy. The grand plea is they are authorized by law. But can law, human law, change the nature of things? Can it turn darkness into light or evil into good? By no means." So the point is that Africans are being taken from their homeland, and this practice is being defended by laws created by those who take them, and Wesley is trying to argue that this doesn't make any logical sense for this to be the case. So he's using a natural law argument in this case to try to make his point. And he's trying to state what he believes to be an obvious argument about the humanity and play off of the humanity of those individuals who are practicing this. He understands it's an uphill battle, but he believes that if he tries to argue from a biblical perspective, people are, of course, going to point out that the Bible supports slavery in many cases. Wesley also argues that in Thoughts Upon Slavery, that from a political image argument, how we're in relationship to one another. Wesley, throughout the essay, argues against the system of slavery, and he goes as far as prodding his fellow English folk who are supporting the slave trade by their funding of merchants who are connected to slavery. So he's saying, while not directly involved, they also have a responsibility for what is happening and are distorting what it means to be in right relationship with their fellow brethren. They are, in fact, supporting the structures of inequality, even if they disagree with slavery. Wesley's point is those individuals who benefit from slavery cannot say, "I am clean," because they help to keep the structures in place. This is an important insight by Wesley, and one that is at the heart of why existing continues to get promoted over equality. It is easy to sort of disavow oneself of responsibility when not directly involved, even while benefiting from the system itself. And Wesley is saying you cannot do that. And of course, the moral image, mirroring God's love, justice, and mercy. Wesley, at the end of the essay, implores those who are Christians to mirror God's love, mercy, and justice. Wesley is calling for them to no longer be separated from God, to recover that which has been lost by the fall. This requires getting out of the slave trade. At this point, Wesley is clearly talking to Christians. And I will also say is where he most clearly is focused on not just ending slavery, but calling for the full humanity of all people. So Wesley's argument is primarily a natural law argument, but I believe also as you read through this, you can see his full anthropology in terms of the political image and the moral image. Wesley is seeking to counter claims against African humanity and his understanding that all people are created in the image of God. Wesley envisions all people being able to be restored in God's image and holiness, and he highlights this as a way for us to actually move towards equality and not simply existing together. So is Wesley's stance still necessary today for those of us in the United States? Many will argue we have moved beyond the issue of the humanity of people of African descent today. While we may agree that today we have racial issues, the issues are not the same as the basic humanity of Africans that Wesley faced. In Wesleyan theological language, we are no longer questioning the journey toward holiness in the United States, but we are just dealing with other sort of tensions. Another way to say this is a few years ago, when someone else was president, we talked about a post-racial society. African American humanity today. If one Googles monkey and Obama, you will see several images come up. While it is unfortunate, it's pretty easy to see both President Obama and Mrs. Obama with various images throughout the internet that will pop up. And this is sort of a first for any president of the United States of America. And this gets at the heart of questioning whether or not they were made in a natural image of God. No other president of the United States has experienced sort of this dehumanizing in the same manner as the Obamas. The fact that both of them are better educated than many other people and presidents of the United States have not stopped this sort of attack on their humanity. Attacks not only questioning the humanity, but ultimately whether African Americans as a whole are made in the image of God. Now, we can say that it's just a few extreme people who are taking these steps. And we can, argue that this is not sort of the perspective or perception of everyone. But the reality is we're seeing a resurgence of people who are willing to sort of voice that sort of animosity and belief that people of African descent are not truly made in the natural image of God. So you're actually seeing an increase of that taking place at this time. If we think of the moral image of God, and we think about gentrification, many of our cities are starting to gentrify, and here in Pittsburgh, you also are starting to see gentrification take place. Typically in a gentrified area, upper middle class white people move into the area and the neighborhood begins to change. The housing prices increase so that those who were local for years can no longer afford to reside in the neighborhood. The soccer field where children once just went and played and hung out during the evening now has to be officially reserved through some form of a government entity. On Sunday, where the common practice was you could park your car and you would block in the people who hadn't gotten out early, now it's against the law to do so. Bicycle lanes are added, taking away parking from the street. And one could argue all of these changes are beneficial because it makes the neighborhood better. And there's some truth to that argument. Yet the changes are not really inclusive of all the voices that are in the neighborhood and lack justice for all the people. So while many of the individuals are benefiting from these changes, there are some who are not. And then what becomes fascinating, if you said that these moves were racist, the people would be shocked that you thought they were racist in making these moves. But they, again, don't understand how the structures are benefiting them, why they are not benefiting other people. So the idea of reflecting God's love sounds good in theory, but when it comes to practices like figuring out how we can actually all live together and make decisions together that are beneficial for the whole community, we stop short of that sort of dialogue and instead, in terms of gentrification, tend to want to move forward with our own agenda that maintain many of these same structures. Bless you. So, in recap, we continue to struggle with blatant racism in the United States. This is illustrated by the portrayal of the Obamas and the increase in deuces, swastikas in the news, etc. At another level, we continue to put on blinders to the ways in which existing together under certain circumstances is promoted. And to a certain degree, this is played out in sort of what I talked about with the gentrification. If we think about the political image, we saw this played out strongly with the kneeling debate in the NFL this past season. And this whole question in terms of hierarchy and the power of the owners over the NFL players over whether or not one could kneel for the national anthem. And it became more polarized and politicized, of course, when Trump got involved in the conversation and the debate for this issue. And at the heart of this was, again, an understanding of sort of relationships and who had the power dynamic in those relationships. So while the NFL players, by our standards, are wealthy, the reality is they're poor compared to the owners who are billionaires and their employers. And we'll even put Kaepernick aside for a minute. There are others like Reed who still have not found work in the NFL because they were kneeling for this, showing sort of, again, that structure of that power dynamic that took place. So using a Wesleyan framework, we can see how challenging it is to move toward wholeness in a racialized culture. It's about more than sort of my personal recovery of the natural, political, or moral image of God, but the way in which we are codifying structures as communities. I have implied, however, that taking the recovery of the Imago Dei seriously from a Wesleyan perspective addresses both the blatant racism and the more nuanced racism we face in the United States. So let me say more about what this recovery means now. For Wesley, the recovery was a part of what it meant to be holy. The recovery is a transformation that lines us up with God and our neighbor. It is when we are loving God and neighbor that we are growing into the image for which we are created. One of the challenges in the recovery of the Imago Dei is how do we translate loving our neighbor as we love ourselves? It is possible that some white individuals are loving their black neighbors as themselves. It just so happens that what they cherish about themselves is the primacy of whiteness. The lens through which they perceive their black neighbor and love their black neighbor capitulates to the very thing that creates structural racial differences. I make this claim not to sort of create animosity, but to really try to help us to think about why we continue to struggle with this issue so deeply. I write these words in an earlier book, Just Us or Just Us. If you Americans live out the words, as you love yourself literally, then it means they continue to buy into the systemic whiteness permeating American culture. Love of self within the American context gets interpreted through Eurocentric religious and cultural values. Wesley's understanding of loving a neighbor as self is not presupposing the form of selfish love that I'm suggesting above. In the following, in the story of the Good Samaritan, is a love for neighbor that places us in the predicament of the neighbor. If the lawyer puts himself in the place of the Samaritan, then he has to come to grips with treating someone who's looked down upon and who is not loved in the same way as he is loving other people. Loving a neighbor as oneself is actually seeing ourselves as our neighbors. I believe this connects with what Wesley was trying to do in Thoughts Upon Slavery, to get white individuals to see themselves as the Africans. This is quite a shift. Wesley was trying to get Europeans to imagine if someone came and took them from their homeland to be slaves, what law could justify such an action? Loving our neighbor as ourselves is not a self-interested love, but one where we put ourselves in our neighbor's place. Wesley, of course, in Thoughts Upon Slavery, primarily uses a natural law argument that emphasizes the natural image of God. Although all three ways he understands the image are present, I'm going to tap into the work of an AME theologian some of you may know by the name of James Cone. James Cone writes, "The image of God refers to the way in which God intends human beings to live in the world. The image of God is thus more than rationality. more than what so-called neo-orthodoxy theologians call divine human encounter. In a world in which persons are oppressed, the image is human nature in rebellion against the structures of oppression. The image is human nature in rebellion against the structures of oppression. Powe picks up important strands of Wesley's understanding of the political image and contextualizes them for our racial dialogue. The idea of the Imago Dei focusing on the way God intends for humans to be in the world correlates to Wesley's relational understanding of the political image. What Cone adds is the rebellion against the structures of oppression. This rebellion is a part of what it means to be human. This rebellion, of course, is aimed at those causing the oppression. Cone also speaks to those who maintain the structures by arguing they must free themselves from their culture in order to join the cultural freedom of the poor. What does it look like to love one's neighbor as oneself? It is freeing yourself from the culture and putting yourself in the culture of those who are oppressed. This is a political act. It is a political act that can move us beyond existing together towards a reality of equality. While it is hard to shift those who do not think African Americans are not human, it should give us pause, or it should give pause to those who simply want to maintain the status quo without real dialogue. Real dialogue means hearing how one's self-interest is perpetuating things that may be harmful to others. So where do we go from here? I believe reclaiming a Wesleyan vision of the image of God, Imago Dei, or the image of God, is important. It pushes us to take seriously what it truly means to be human. In reclaiming this vision, we must fill in what it means to recover the natural, moral, and political image of God, or we're just left accepting existing together is as good as it's going to get. We must pay more attention to our understanding of loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. This can be a challenge if the love is selfish in a way that promotes the primacy of whiteness. And finally, toward this end, I am hopeful that white Wesleyans will not only laud Wesley for his stance against slavery, but will speak about his promoting equality. It is one thing to be against something, but another to advocate for something. I am hopeful that white Wesleyans will not simply write about loving God and neighbor, but will help congregations to understand what unselfish love looks like. I pray that white Wesleyans will be in conversations that challenge them to promote equality over existing. And let me close with Wesley's last letter, which was to Wilberforce, and this was the last thing he wrote. He said, "Dear sir, unless the divine power has raised you to be as Athanasius, contra mundum, I see not how you can go through your glorious enterprise in opposing that execrable villainy which is the scandal of religion of England and of human nature. Lest God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God before you, who can be against you? Are all of them together stronger than God? Oh, be not weary of well-doing. Go on in the name of God and in the power of his might, till even American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun, shall vanish away before it." Reading this morning a tract wrote by a poor African, I was particularly struck by that circumstance that a man who has black skin being wronged or outraged by a white man can have no redress. It being a law in our colonies that the oath of a black against a white goes for nothing. What villainy is this? That he who has guided you from youth up may continue to strengthen you in this and all things is the prayer of your dear servant, John Wesley. Wesley, in his last letter to Wilberforce, seeks to up the ante, to change the dialogue. He presses Wilberforce to keep fighting to end slavery, but not just to end it, to address the fact that Africans are not given full human rights similar to Europeans and whites in the United States. I am arguing that Wesley is seeking equality. Wesley understands just how challenging this will be. In fact, Wesley foreshadowed Dred Scott's famous line, "No rights which the white man is bound to respect," in his last letter to Wilberforce. Wesley calls it a villainy. I like to believe it is a villainy that we are settling for existing together and not actually seeking true equality with one another. And I will end there and open it up for questions and answers.